we are recording right now. Okay, I think we have a lot of attendees that are coming in. So let me start this session, this seminar. Hello, everyone. This seminar is called the MIPP Talk. My name is Raimundo Undurraga. I am assistant professor of economics at the Department of Industrial Engineering here at the University of Chile. Today we have a very distinguished speaker. His name is John List. John is the Kenneth Griffin Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago and editor of the Journal of Political Economy, one of the top 5 in the discipline. So he's one of the leading experts in the literature of experimental economics, if not the leader of that literature. His work has been tremendously influential in economic sciences during the last 25 years. So his research focuses mostly on questions in microeconomics, with a particular emphasis on using field experiments to address both positive and normative issues. For decades, his field experimental research has focused on issues related to the inner workings of markets, the effects of various incentive schemes on market equilibrium and allocations, how behavioral economics can augment the standard economic model, research on early childhood education and interventions, and most recently on the gender earning gap in the gig economy. So in the next 30 minutes, John will be presenting his new book titled The Voltage Effect: How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale. Then right after John's presentation, we will open a panel discussion with Brian Cooper from the Government Budget Office here in Chile and Marcelo Olivares from University of Chile, where we will be discussing about how and when to scale up successful interventions. So during the presentation, I will be collecting some questions from the public through the chat, and then we'll read them aloud during the panel discussion. So John, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's really an honor for us to have you here today. So please, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you so much for that very kind and thorough introduction. I appreciate your kind words. So today I'm going to talk for about a half hour about my new book, and I'll have a slide deck. And the way I want you to think about this is it's in my own career, it's the next step in my research agenda. I've focused a lot on using the world as my lab. And many of you have probably been my experimental subjects. If you've flown on United Airlines, if you've used Google or Facebook, or if you used Uber in the past, then you've probably been one of my experimental subjects. So really, my life has been devoted to using the world to figure out causal relationships between variables and how to make the world a better place. Okay, so that's basically where I'll be starting today. I'll share my screen now, if I can. Raimundo, does that look good? Okay, very good. So the book is titled The Voltage Effect. And what I want to ask today is, why do so many ideas fail to deliver on their promise when scaled? And my riddle today will be, what can Nancy Reagan, Uber, and an early childhood program teach us about those broken promises? Okay, so where this story starts is with a pre-K program in Chicago Heights. Chicago Heights is a suburb of Chicago, just south of Chicago. And they approached me around 2005, asking if I could help make their city more vibrant and make their city more electric. And where we started with that program was their educational system. In particular, about 12 years ago, I started an early childhood program basically from scratch. And what early childhood means in the United States is from 0 to 6 years old. In the US, there is not compulsory schooling during those years. Once a child reaches the age of 6, they go into public education. They go from public education from 6 to 18, and then they're done with high school. So the idea was, let's learn about the education production function, and let's use a field experiment whereby we, from scratch, produce an early childhood program that will include a program for parents, for children, in an effort not only to test theory, but also to develop a curriculum that the rest of the world can use. Okay, now we've been at this for about 12 years, but turning back the clock a little bit to 2014, at that point, we had great results. We were finding that our programs were moving executive function skills in a very important way. They were moving cognitive skills in a very important way, and they were influencing what we believe to be important surrogates that were giving a good signal of these kids are off to the right start. And this is a very poor community, so it's very difficult without a program like this to get the children off to a good start. Okay, so at this point, 2014, I am super proud of a program that I spent 8-9 years developing. Now comes the slap in the face. I shop my idea to policymakers, and it's not to sell the program, the curriculum that I developed, it's to give it away for free. I just want kids to have it. That's the idea. Here's what I was met with, the type of resistance. Professor List, your program had an impressive benefit profile, but don't expect it to happen at scale. Like, well, why is that the case? And the typical response was, it just doesn't have the silver bullet. I'm like, well, wait a second here. I developed this program using a field experiment to develop the best curriculum possible. What do you mean silver bullet? And then they would typically go on to say, all of the experts tell us their interventions will work, but the treatment results are never close to what they promise. I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. What do you mean by that? And they say, well, we're not really sure why it happens, but there's this new field called implementation science. And it's true, that field started around 2007, 2008, mostly social psychologists interested in implementation of programs. And they've typically argued that it's because of fidelity. And what I mean by that is when it gets scaled, it's fundamentally a different program that happens at scale than what was tested. It's a little bit like if you should be taking one pill every day and you do that during the experiment, when you scale it, maybe the person takes one pill every month. That's fundamentally a different program, and you've lacked the faithfulness or the fidelity to that program. Okay. So the first insight here is the fact that we find a great result in the Petri dish, but then when we scale it, it gets to be a really, well, kind of May result or a smaller result. Is that true? In fact, it is. This is what I call the voltage effect. It's effectively making a mountain into a molehill. I got a great result in the initial study. I scale it, it's a molehill. Okay, that's more or less, if you want to think about laws in economics, we have law of demand, law of supply, law of comparative advantage, etc. This would be as close to a law as those types of laws. Now, where we started then was, as any good economist will start, we created economic theory because we wanted to know, in the mounds and mounds of data, we wanted some flashlights. And what flashlights to me means is I go into a dark room and I'm not sure where to look, but economic theory helps me. And it helps tell me where to look in the data. Okay, so our theory is essentially a game theoretic model. And it looks at the different actors involved, researchers, policymakers, funders, participants, practitioners, etc., These are all actors involved in the creation of science, the dissemination of science, and the implementation of science. We looked in our models at the underlying incentives that each of these people faced to try to figure out, is there something structural in our system that leads to a voltage effect? Now we put all that together, and I'm going to save you all the gory math. We then combine it with what I call DNA evidence from a bunch of studies and a bunch of ideas, you know, what scaled, what didn't, and what was the DNA of those ideas. And along comes a bunch of academic papers. So this is my area of work that I call the science of using science. The first two papers are very accessible. The first one is basically what can we learn and what are the threats to scalability. The second one is a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper looking at the medical literature and saying, what can we learn from the medical literature? They face the exact same issues that we have. The third paper is some of the theoretical developments, literally titled The Science of Using Science, and it just came out in the International Economic Review that lays out the theoretical model in the various predictions. And then this is a more policy-based piece on what kind of role experiments can play in public policy. And it takes from the theory and the data a bunch of proposals for policymakers. And as I put down here, this is a special issue where this particular paper is the first paper in the issue. And then there are roughly 10 scholars from around the social sciences and stats and medicine that comment on our work. They comment on our economic model of scaling. Okay, so that's sort of a potpourri of things that you can look for if you want to read the underlying academic papers. Okay, but now what I'm going to come back to is the book. Okay, now my thesis here is, well, the policymakers were correct in saying there's a voltage effect problem. Where they were wrong is when they said it's a silver bullet problem. It's actually not. You should think of the problem more as a weakest link problem. It's not, do you have the secret sauce? Is, does your idea have the 5 vital signs that it will need to be confident about scaling? And the way I think about this is, these are moderator variables that give us insights about the breadth and depth of our particular idea or policy. Okay, now the rest of the lecture, I'm going to just unpack these 5 things, which is really what the first half of the book does. Okay, so the 5 vital signs, what are they? So basically now let's step back and remember, what am I doing? I'm doing an accounting exercise to explore what are the 5 vital signs in an idea that cause it to fail at scale. Okay, so the first one is, there was never any voltage to begin with. It was simply a false positive. Okay, now we know this as economists. This is the inference problem. In the book, it's hard to explain statistical error and inference in a popular book, so I call it the data are lying. It's the same to think of it as a false positive. Now, what that brings to light right away is the import of replication. The hard sciences have this figured out. In the social sciences, we really don't yet. We're grappling with it, and I think we're making strides in the right direction. So let's come back now to check. So if you put this in perspective, we do a study in Chicago Heights on early childhood. Now I'm just taking this post-study probability equation here. This comes from a paper that I published in the AER with Maniitis and Tufano. It's basically Bayesian approach to updating your priors. Okay, so pi is the prior, 1 minus beta is the power of the experiment, alpha is the significance level, so this is your statistical error. So why I'm bringing this out now is, let's start with the notion of, you know what, I think John's idea about check is rubbish, and it's a long shot. It will be a shock if he finds a good result. Okay, so that's what I'm calling a prior of 1%. Now my test was properly powered. So after my original study, you update your belief from 1% to 2%. Most of the time, policymakers think if it's in an academic journal, it must be the truth. It's peer reviewed. This tells you if it's a surprise, it's likely still wrong. In fact, this paper, it's titled in AER, One Swallow Doesn't Make a Summer. The first title was also all empirical results in major journals are wrong, because the idea was to get into a major journal, it has to be a surprise. So to be a surprise, you have to have a really small prior. And if even with well-powered studies, it's not going to be very high, 1 in 50 here roughly. Okay, let's say I replicate that. Now I'm up to 10%. Replicate it again, 47%. Replicate it again, 91%. Now we're kind of more in business. That's when we can start to be sure that the results are correct. Now, as a policymaker, you can set the PSP for whatever you want. With Czech, it's a little bit hard. This is a $5 or $10 million study, and it takes a lot of time. So what you want to do, I believe, is test elements of it, test pieces of it to get to the conclusion faster. Now, in America, this is a great example. It might not be a great example for Chileans, but when I was in high school, Nancy Reagan, she was the first lady to President Reagan. Her big campaign was she wants to stop teens from taking drugs. And the campaign that she pushed was an educational campaign called DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. I can still remember when the officials came into my high school. I was in high school in 1985 and 86. And they come in and they say, just say no. I looked at my teacher and said, look, I don't use drugs, but I have a lot of friends who do. And there's no way this program's working. No way. The teacher looked at me and said, well, John, they actually have data that show that it works. And here, it's exactly true, they did. And it would be a great punchline to say they had data from 10 kids, but they did. The data actually was from roughly 1,700 kids from Honolulu. So it looked pretty good. But in the end, it just turned out when we went back, we spent millions of dollars on this campaign and a bunch of hours going into schools. It just so happened that that was just a false positive. It never had voltage to begin with. It would have been easy to replicate that very quickly, but we didn't. And we waste a lot of money and time. That's vital sign number one. Vital sign number two is what I call properties of the population, or in the book, I call it know your audience. So here what I'm talking about is horizontal scaling or spread. In the economics literature, a lot of times we talk about this in terms of generalizability or external validity. We have a result in Chicago Heights. Do those results apply to others? You know, for Chicago Heights, it's a certain SES, race, background, certain parental structure. That is all set in one particular situation or one domain. Does that result spread to other areas in a horizontal sense? So what I'm saying here is across input markets. So in an ocular sense, we find that it's not a false positive in Illinois. Try it in California, try it in Denver, try it in Atlanta, try it in New York City. This is horizontally scaling the program. And it's simply multi-site testing from the very beginning. So why don't we multi-site test from the beginning rather than do it slowly in one site? Okay. Now, a more international example is we can think about anemia. Anemia afflicts a lot of people worldwide. Some experts estimate 1.6 billion people are affected by anemia. Now, the doctors say that one leading cause is iron deficiency. So what they did in India is they conducted several small-scale studies on double fortified salt. That's salt fortified with iron and iodine. And they find that it works for young females. It's a great result. That's your population, young females. But they extrapolated and said in 2012, let's take this thing nationwide. And they rolled it out to everyone. Guess what happened? It worked for young females. It didn't work for anyone else. They didn't appreciate the properties of the population. And this isn't just a criticism of the Indian government. This happens all the time, whereby we think, either through theory or intuition or whatever, that the results will scale horizontally when we really have no evidence. So that's bin number 2. That happens a lot. Bin number 3 moves it from the population of people to the population of situations. Okay, in the book, the title of this chapter is called, Is it the Chef or is it the Ingredients? And here, I mean, when restaurants scale, if the secret sauce is the chef, it will fail every time. If the secret sauce is the ingredients and those ingredients are replicable, it will work. And it's just that simple, that humans don't scale well. Now, in this particular case, I want you to think about the horizontal scaling meets vertical scaling. So in some ways, I'm in the same input market and I'm going across other input markets. Now, when you vertically scale, we have to think about infrastructural needs. Do we have the same inputs in infrastructure that we had in the Petri dish? Do we have that at scale? Do we have administrator buy-in? Now, I'm going to talk in a moment about when the administrators know the whys behind a program, such as why does a program work? They're much more faithful to the program. And that's an important result from a scaling and fidelity perspective. Now, for me in Czech, think about this. It was okay and pretty easy to hire 30 good teachers. What about hiring 30,000 teachers in the same input market? That's not working, right? It's impossible. Pretty hard to find 30, much less 30,000 in the same input market, isn't it? Okay. Now, I want to dig into this because this bucket's very important. And as I mentioned before, fidelity is increased when we know the whys. Use technology whenever you can. At this point, as a policymaker, you must demand what are the negotiables and what are the non-negotiables in your idea. And then you have to think about when we scale, are those non-negotiables in place at scale like they were in the Petri dish? Now, also on fidelity, what I found is that when you use the original scientist on the implementation team, this helps a lot with fidelity. And the reason why is because we have totally different mindsets. When I worked in the White House and when I talk to policymakers, it's a certain kind of brain. When I talk to scientists, there are a lot of different things going on in the scientist's mind that might not actually be very clear or elucidated well. Having both of these minds at the table when it comes time to implement is very, very important. Now, the proposal here is we commonly block on individual characteristics in our empirical analyses. And what I mean by that is we make sure that men and women are represented in treatment and control, old and young, black and white, et cetera, et cetera. We do a good job in blocking on individual characteristics. But what we don't do is block on situations of the environment, i.e. like in the teacher example, I should have some poor, some medium, and some really good teachers. Then I can explore whether the teachers themselves are non-negotiables. And that gives me an idea about whether this can scale or not. Here I'm advocating something that's a little bit radical. Usually we think of evidence-based policy, efficacy tests, give the theory and the program its best shot. I'm advocating altogether something different. I'm talking about policy-based evidence. Take the warts that are going to happen at scale, bring them back, and see if your program works. If your program doesn't work, change it. Don't scale it. It's not time to find that it doesn't work after we scale. And after we say, wow, I didn't know that that constraint was going to happen. We should be better than that. Now, for all the policymakers on here, when the program is actually scaled, just do me a favor and give we researchers a chance to examine whether it worked or not. And I'm not talking about a full-blown RCT, that'd be great, but just give us like an RD or a difference in difference. Give us something to where we can at least explore, did that thing work at scale? That's not only important for whether the program is working, but it's also important to come back and test our ideas about scaling. So this, when I started this research agenda, it wasn't the easiest because a lot of times at scale, we roll out programs that are impossible to determine whether it had any voltage at scale. That made my problem a lot harder. So that came to me like, wow, why are policymakers doing this in a more effective way? At least do a rollout design or something, okay? We can dig into that more during the questions if we want. Now for businesses, this is kind of an interesting example. I've worked on smart technology, and the engineers tell us smart technology will have these great gains on energy conservation in the household. When you look at their assumptions, they are basically assuming that every human is like Spock. And this is the ultra rational, can compute very difficult problems in the drop of a hat. That's how Spock is in the great Star Wars scenes. Let's face it, really, most of us are Homer Simpson. And we have this new paper coming out that shows the engineering estimates are wildly too optimistic once you take into account how dumb humans are. And in this case, what they do is they undo all the good stuff that the smart technology puts in your house by overriding with offsets. So it's almost amazing the way humans are able to mess this up. That's something we should have figured out that's going to happen at scale. Okay, so vital sign number 5, understand general equilibrium and spillover effects. Okay, so let me start with GE effects. Here's what we typically do when we run experiments, like in Czech. We get a group of kids, we randomize some into treatment, some into control, and we say ceteris paribus. That's a reduced form insight, an average treatment effect that has internal validity. That's good stuff. That's not what we want to learn at scale. What we want to learn at scale is what is the difference when every kid in society is treated versus when no one is treated. And in particular, if you perturb the whole system, that might be very different than when you just perturb part of the system. In the book, I talk about what happened to us at Uber. So at Uber, we pay drivers based on the time, the number of minutes that they have somebody in their back seat, and the number of miles that they drive. That's called the rate card. They're paid by minute, by mile. So we went into a market and we said, we really want to raise drivers' wages. So we increased the rate card for 5% of the drivers. It worked. Labor supply was like 0.4. So they worked more, they got paid more per hour, everything was great. Guess what happened when we rolled that out to the entire market? Same thing happened. Supply curve shifted out, but voila, it shifted out in a way that it undid all of the good stuff of the rate card increase. And in the end, sure, more drivers were working, but they were driving around with empty cars more often. And what happens is they make exactly the same wages per hour is what they did before the rate card changed. And it was because the market came to a new equilibrium. Now here, we just have to recognize when G effects are important, those first trials might tell us very little about what happens at scale. And I know we're going to have a discussion about this in the panel time, okay? I go through several other examples on G effects in the book as well. Now on spillovers, this is a different kind of effect, but what we had in Czech is that our treatment kids spilled over to our control kids. And what I mean by that is if you were a control kid, i.e. you came into our program, but you got no treatment from us, what we find is that if you live nearby a bunch of treatment kids, and the exact result is if 11 treatment kids live within 1,000 feet of your house, it was like you were treated yourself. So that's a very important spillover from treatment to control. We also find treatment to treated, control to control, but we have to understand those spillovers before we can be sure what's going to happen at scale. Okay, finally, all of you are likely good Chicago economists, so you may have been wondering, John keeps talking demand side, demand side, demand side, demand side. What happened to the supply side? That's vital sign number 5. And that's an easy one. That's our bread and butter. It's basically determining whether your idea has economies of scale or diseconomies of scale. So just think about check. To pass hurdle number 3, vital sign number 3, I have to hire 30,000 teachers who have the same quality as we had in the Petri dish. So if you set that as a constraint, guess what's going to happen to your budget if you have to hire 30,000 high quality teachers? Good luck, right? You have to go up the supply curve. And now the voltage effect is not going to happen on the benefit side. It's going to happen on the supply side. What's super interesting about the implementation science literature is that they never talk about the supply side. So when we added our economic model, of course, we had both demand and supply side considerations. But it's very obvious that in our studies, we should be reporting what does the supply side look like. We never do that. But when we're talking about scaling, we really need to. Okay, so at this point, you might be thinking, I have a few minutes left. John, what about something that's truly scalable? Let's talk about polio vaccinations and Jonas Salk. So a long time ago, Salk started by, he had a theory. And you know what? The first few people he injected were his own kids. That's typically what a lot of hard scientists do. I do that as a social scientist. I test a lot of my, let's say, new programs on one of my 8 kids. In fact, I have twin boys, so I have like the perfect A/B test because I have a lot of other things controlled for. So Salk tries it with his kids, seems to work. Tries it, Petri dish, works. Scales it up, finds it's not a false positive. Check. Vital sign number 2, does it work for the entire population? Check, it does. It doesn't discriminate, it works for everyone. Vital sign number 3 is where the current COVID vaccination status in the US really falters. Here's the brilliance behind the polio vaccination. Is when you think about scaling vaccinations, the hard part now, and this happens a lot in the medical literature, is delivery. It's not necessarily that we have something good, it's get it in their arms or medication adherence. These are hard problems. The brilliance behind this idea is that for all of us who have had kids, we know what happens. Kid comes out, kid gets some shots. Kid comes back in 6 months, they get more vaccinations. Comes back in a year, more vaccinations. The polio vaccine leverages the healthcare system. So it's very efficient and it happens just in the natural course of, I want to check and make sure my kid's doing okay. 4, we have brilliant spillovers, of course. Once you get the vaccination, it doesn't spread. And then 5, the cost side, since it's part of the healthcare system, the delivery has economies of scale, and of course, the innovation has economies of scale too. Okay, now you might ask, well, what about business? Let's go to the Uber app. When I show you 2 prices, like maybe one time I show you $7.94, the other time I show you $7.93, by and large, you won't know the difference or discern between these 2 prices. I can show you that in the data. However, you will discern between these 2 prices. And this is because humans tend to focus on the leftmost digit in a price. It's called left digit bias. So lo and behold, what happens in Uber and Lyft data is that 50% of the reason why the demand curve is downward sloping is because of that 1 penny change around the integer. The other 50% because of the law of demand, or what's causing the law of demand, is the other 99-cent changes. Okay, so the law of demand is, in our data, 50% caused by left digit bias. Okay, so that's not a false positive. 2, it works for everyone, which is really interesting. 3, it works in nearly every situation: bar time, morning commute, afternoon commute, whether it's raining. Left-digit bias is one of the most robust biases I've ever seen. Now, spillovers, it can work here because we can turn on and off left-digit bias. If we get short on the market, we can go up to 803. If we have a lot of drivers, move it down to 799. Okay, so you can naturally compare that. And then the cost is, we have to give you a price anyway. So there are huge economies of scale. So this is a business idea that checks all of the boxes and it's scalable. Okay, now just to give you a little bit about the back half of the book talks about ideas that after you figure out if you have a launchable idea, after launch, the book just goes through various, what I call the 4 little economic secrets to maintaining high voltage. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and give the obligatory plug. This is the book. Thanks for listening to me, and I will stop sharing now and go back to the panel.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for your very insightful presentation. While I was hearing your presentation, I thought, well, probably most of us who dedicate our research time to implement social experiments typically think on partial effects. But at the end of the day, maybe the big question is on the world of general equilibrium effects. So now I realize how important it is to think on this big, on these 5 beetles that you call in your book. So thank you very much. I think this is very promising for our career research. I think it's very important for the development of our discipline. So now let me introduce you the other 2 speakers who are going to lead the panel discussion now. The first is Ryan Cooper. He's a senior researcher at the budget office of the Chilean government. And Marcelo Olivares, who is a professor at the Department of Industrial Engineering here at the University of Chile. So they will be leading our panel discussion. The title of the panel is How and When to Scale Up Successful Interventions. So Ryan will start presenting in 3 minutes his experience at the experimental unit within the budget office, which is a new initiative that started around 3 years ago. And then Marcelo will talk about the challenges associated to scaling up one of the successful interventions that were managed within this unit. So in case people in the public have questions, please write down your questions, and then I will try to collect some of them, speak aloud about, and then I will try to see if maybe John can have some insights on your questions. Okay, so please, Ryan, the floor is yours. You have around 3 minutes. Thank you. You're muted.
Hello, everybody. Hello, John. I want to share my screen. And please tell me if you can you see the presentation?
Yeah, it works well. No problem.
You can still see it?
Yeah, I can still see it.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for your presentation, John. It's really exciting and interesting to see what you've been working on in the regards of not only experimenting but scaling and the science that's behind that. I mean, it's really interesting. I started to read your book that Raimundo shared a copy with me, but now I'm definitely gonna read the whole thing in depth. So it looks really exciting, and I thank you so much. So I'm gonna briefly explain, basically describe what we call the experimental policy initiative, and basically you will see why this is a great timing to be studying what you've been working on, John, regarding scaling. Okay, so in 2018, the current Minister of Finance, Rodrigo Cerda, who at the time was the director of the Budget Office. He had the objective, amongst many objectives, he had the objective of generating policy evidence on the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of different programs and policies in order to allocate resources as the Budget Office objective, but also in terms of in terms of innovating, of social innovation, right? So he hired me and he asked me to work on this, and what we tried to do was to create a model that would reduce the different restrictions and challenges that we have in social science and public policy, basically regarding to the agency issues. Like, as you mentioned in your presentation, not only in scaling, but before that, in producing science for evaluating a pilot, you have lots of different agents that are involved, and you may have coordination issues and different agency issues. So how can we do this? So we try to design what we call the experimental policy initiative. And the first thing we did was say, well, okay, so in order to reduce these challenges, let's start by trying to produce evidence locally, internally. So let's have projects that experiments that we run from the government, where we can partner with different academics, but basically we run it inside, and that would sort of reduce many of the different programs. And the second thing we looked at was basically looking at new programs. So new programs and pilots, we studied the ex-ante evaluation that exists already in the Budget Office, and we identified different programs and pilot programs that could be evaluated. Okay, but then we said there are also, and especially in countries like Chile, you can have programs that haven't been scaled for decades, and they exist. So there's still existing programs that where there can be excess demand, and you can have experimental evaluations or study them as natural experiments also. So we also evaluated those programs. But then we said, while it's probably easier to do these evaluations internally, we may be missing lots of good ideas. So why don't we also work with external academics through an impact evaluation fund, where we have a contest and different academics can bring their ideas of how to evaluate public programs. So based on this model, since 2018, we have designed and started to work with 12 controlled experiments, 3 natural experiments, are basically RD design. And also through the Impact Evaluation Fund, we have started 4 controlled experiments, 5 natural experiments, RD and IV design. And in terms of scale up, well, given that this is new, there hasn't been much, but there have been 2 scale ups that have already occurred. One of them happened before we produced the evidence, so we can't say that it's based on the results of our evaluation. While we were doing the impact evaluation, the program was scaling at the same time. And the other one was an information RCT regarding taxes of different people. And we had a pilot of 160,000 people, which we scaled to 3 million. And that was also based on the evidence that we had. And we have one ongoing scale up, which is a very interesting case, which Marcelo will talk a bit more about, that we're actually having these questions right now. And hopefully we'll have many more scale ups with all these other evaluations that we've started. So it's really interesting to hear you, John, and it will be great to be able to talk more with you about how we should engage these situations. And the scaling is in 2 dimensions. One, we want to scale and see which programs need to be scaled and how to do it. But we also want to scale the model. We want to scale because one thing is 12 RCTs may seem a lot, but if you compare it with the supply of policies and programs of the government, it's nothing. We need much more evidence production. So we need to scale the model itself. And it will be interesting to be able to talk a bit about this with you too. So now I'll let Marcelo talk a bit more about this, the project, the RCT that we've worked together with Universidad de Chile that's ongoing at this time. The scale up is ongoing.
Thank you, Ryan, for the intro. So I'm going to talk very briefly about this project so that we leave some time for questions. But this is part of a longer research agenda that we've been ongoing work for like more than 5 years in trying to reduce the spending in government procurement. So these are all the products and services that the government purchases to fulfill their goal of providing public goods. And so basically we have identified 3 possible mechanisms that typically lead to overspending in procurement. The first one has to do with transaction costs. So where basically the managers on the public system, they face some difficulties in trying to reduce this overspending because there's search frictions, because they don't get to select the right suppliers when they choose where to purchase. And all of these things lead to higher costs. And the other 2 are related more to incentives in terms of how you actually provide incentives for the public officials to exert effort to try to reduce this spending in procurement. And there's also some pervasive incentives in which the government units have to spend all their budget. So there's basically no price for actually lowering your costs and having some surplus in the budget. Okay, so well, we started working on this field experiment where basically the main objective was, first of all, to have an objective measure of overspending. So for certain types of purchases, you could track exactly what managers are buying, and then compare that with other products sold by other suppliers that are comparable to those products but sold at a lower cost. So basically, you can measure what was the overprice that this purchase had, and through that, by aggregation, calculate a measure of overspending for each manager and for different services. And so the intervention here was to provide this information to the services and to the managers. And we did 2 types of treatments. One treatment was to provide the information only to the manager himself, right? And sort of provide them information of their historical overspending. And in the other treatment, we provided the information to the manager and also to the head of the unit. Okay, so basically to his boss, right? And so what we saw here is that we saw an effect, but only when you did both together. So this is kind of a combination of lowering these transaction costs, lowering the search frictions, but at the same time aligning incentives from the managers to the principal, so that indeed they would put some effort in trying to find this to lower their expenses. Okay, and so we did this we conducted this experiment over the course of 2020 until now, and now we're in the process of trying to scaling this up to the rest of all of the government units, but also to other product categories. And so here I wanted to have maybe the first question to you, John. I mean, one of the challenges we face in this type of scaling, and even through the implementation of the pilot studies, is the changes in leadership, right? And so you mentioned in one of your vitals this idea of the mindset, right? So that typically you have different mindsets from the scientists and from policymakers, and you need basically to have leadership that is somehow aligned with this mindset. And what happens, especially in governments in Chile, which you renew every 4 years, that when you typically ending up your pilot study, there's a change in government, and then when the time comes up to scale, it's not clear that the new leadership will be aligned in scaling up things that basically worked. And so I wanted to also get your perspective on that and how this sort of changes in leadership can somehow be mitigated to make this scalable project successful.
Are we gonna ask the questions all together, or Raimundo?
I think it's easier if we pinpoint
Ping pong?
one by
Okay.
one. I think it's
Okay, great.
So can I provide my response to Marcelo? Is that appropriate?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Ryan and Marcelo, that's awesome. That's you're Ryan, congratulations. You're very advanced for let's say a typical government body that I talk to. So I'm very happy to see this. Marcelo, this is like a great natural field experiment that you're talking about here. And you ask a really good question on two dimensions. One dimension is, so I wrote this paper back in 2011 on why economists should run field experiments and 14 tips for pulling one off. And one of the tips was basically you have to be working with a stable leader. And because when you enter a firm or an organization, a lot of times we enter at a very low level. And then by the time it gets to the top, they say, there's no way in heck we're going to do that. Or in your case, the top says, let's do it. But the top changes. And I talk about a story that happened to me. One of my CEOs I was working with got shipped to Venezuela. And I talk about that in the 2011 paper. Same thing that you're going through. My experiences with that have been like in government, where most of the stuff got done, it was with the permanent people. And then the government appointees came and went. But if you got the permanent people who were bought in, a lot of times what happens in government is you come in, you say, okay, these are the top line things. And then there's some residual where you can kind of work on what you want. I'm not sure if it's the same in Chile, but if you have that mindset in place, I believe you can at least attenuate some of the issues you're talking about, but those issues are very real, whether it concerns scaling or just doing an idea, just doing a test that you haven't rolled it out in time, so to speak, and then a new leader comes in. But what I found in the US government, at least, is if I can get what we called lifers all involved, that they actually had enough influence to affect at least the culture around it. Now, what they couldn't affect is, this is what our organization's going to do. We're going to do Energy Star. And that's a Republican thing, or that's a Democratic thing. That's a thing that they can't change. But I think what they can change is the mindset around how to think about scaling in the checklist that we should go through before we scale something. So when the new idea comes in, I still think the vital signs, look, what I'm talking about are just general insights. It's not a complex behavioral intervention. It's not a nudge. It's like every idea should undergo this tire kicking, the 5 tires, so to speak, the 5 vital signs. And that's the culture that I want to talk about. Now, what you're talking about is something very realistic. Well, now we're going to have to scale something else when a new group comes in, but it's still, the decision-making should still stay the same in regards to what we should scale. Right, the signatures. Yeah, you're welcome, Marcelo.
Thank you.
So I would like to ask you, John, you mentioned this vital sign of checking the false positive with replication. Yeah. And typically one replicates studies that are effective. But what happens if your study is not effective and your hypothesis was that it should be effective or that it might be effective? Does it make sense to replicate studies, pilots that were not effective in the first place? That's my first question. The second one that is sort of related, especially in places like where I work, like the budget office, when the budget office tries to look after the money, right? So you're also very interested in studies that are results that are not effective. So what happens with what's your view on scale downs? Is there some, like, should we be thinking about specific things with scale downs when you have a program that you find is not effective at scale or midway and you want to reduce it?
No, great question, Brian. On the first one, the equation that I put up on the screen, the Bayesian equation with the post-study probability, that works both ways. In fact, we have a study that shows when you find a null, it goes from 0.9 to 0.84. If you find another null, it goes down. So that equation is working for both nulls and rejections of nulls. And of course, some nulls, like very tight nulls, are more informative than loose nulls. And that's about both the power and in your design. So you should do and use that equation for both. Now, your scale down is a really interesting question. So in chapter 7 of the book, it's called Revolution on the Margins. And chapter 8 is called Winners Quit. And those are both relating to how to scale something down. So the story that I go through in chapter 7 is what happened to us at Lyft. So I was a chief economist at Uber. I'm currently the chief economist at Lyft. And during the pandemic, 22% of my colleagues were fired. We also had to slash expenses. So whenever there's a big structural shock in a system, that's when you have a shot to make change. So I wrote this, what I call the Adam Smith memo. The Adam Smith memo was basically, let's stop thinking on averages, because whenever you sit in these board meetings, you have averages presented to you. So at Lyft, what's a good example of that? I walk into a meeting and there's a driver acquisition team. And what they do is they place advertisements to attract new drivers. So they show that, look, on average, it cost us $500 in Google to get one new driver. And on Facebook, it costs $490 to get a new driver. So they're about the same. But if you dig into that and say, what did we spend on the last 10 drivers on Google or the last 10 drivers on Lyft? On Facebook, what you find is that you spent double on Facebook than Google. So if we just simply scale back Facebook and put the money into Google, we can double our output for the same expenditure. That's thinking on the margin. Now, in terms of quitting, then that kind of leads to a lot of ideas don't work, or maybe they worked at the beginning, but they didn't evolve, or they evolved in the wrong way to where something that doesn't work. I think in life, policymaking and in life, if you're thinking about quitting something, it's probably already too late. You should have quit yesterday. And the reason why is because we always neglect opportunity cost of time. We always neglect that every minute we're doing this particular project, we're not able to do another one. And that's just a human tendency to not value the opportunity cost of time. So there's science about that. Steve Levitt and I designed an experiment on whether people want to quit relationships, quit their job, et cetera, et cetera. What happens is after the fact, after you've quit, you're a lot happier than if you would have stayed the status quo. So society always teaches us that quitting's bad, have grit, blah, blah, blah. If you're going down the wrong hole continuously, let's face it, you should have quit a long time ago. So that's the same kind of idea that you're talking about. Thinking on the margins and quitting sooner rather than later are things that organizations always fail at. I see it all the time, but those are things like our simple economic thinking that we always fail.
Thank you very much.
I also have a question, John. I was thinking on that pretty much the money here is on whether your idea is going to be successful or not when you scale it up. And we spend most of our time, implementing field experiments, trying to test the effectiveness of pilot interventions. Right. And then we publish a lot of papers, showing that evidence. But now that I start to thinking more seriously, how uninformative it is just to having one experimental evidence, and how important it is to scale it up and to learn about the effects at the scale up level. Do you have any idea on how should we think in terms of, it's very costly to implement experiments. You need a partnership, you need time, you need to be able to randomize, it is very costly to implement many times the surveys, to put up some teams in the field. So given that you have already invested all those type of resources implementing your experiment, and now you want to learn what's gonna be the payment when you scale it up. I wonder whether there is any effective way to continue learning experimentally the effects of this kind of intervention at the scale-up level. I mean, I know that that's. I mean, it is impossible to learn about the general equilibrium effect experimentally at the beginning, right? Because you would need to treat everyone, right? But I'm trying to think if there is a middle ground, between those two worlds.
No, I think it's a great question. So let me start by saying, I am not killing my past self. My past self in the early 90s, who started to use the world to test economic theory, should also be my current self. So let's be very clear that it's very important to test theory and learn about facts in causal relationships. Full stop. All I'm saying is that was my entire life until 2014. And then I started to think, that's great, but what about this new thing? And this new thing to me, I believe in 20 years, we will be doing our research altogether differently, because I think we can have the tests of theory that I had in the past with my field experiments and other people have, plus insights on some aspects of scaling. Now, something in between. Let's say that, let's go back to Czech. Let's say that in Czech, I had a parent academy in there where I teach the parents directly, and I don't teach the children. That was one part of Czech. It's called the parent academy part. Let's say that I had a model that said, if we generalize this result, it's mostly going to go to families that only have one parent. So the families in Czech, let's say, have two parents. So I better oversample those with one parent, because when I horizontally scale, that's what the feature is going to be that's different than what I have in this particular sample. That's on the sample. I could also say on the teacher side, when I scale, especially when I vertically scale, it's going to be hard to find really good teachers. So I might want to oversample the left tail of teachers to learn immediately whether that's an important non-negotiable. So now I'm not only testing the theory, but I'm also learning something that my theory and what I observe in the real world was going to happen when I scale it. That's what I'm talking about, making slow steps to policy-based evidence. And I think in the end, there's going to be a mixture. I think we're going to look back, like right now, we look back at what I did in the 90s and say, what was John thinking? How did that get in the AER? Like stuff that I published back in the AER in the 90s, it would get desk rejected today. That's great. That's a good, we've really evolved. Now, we're going to do the same thing on this dimension, I believe. I think we're going to say, did we learn about the mediators? Did we learn about the moderators in a way that allows us to learn something deeper than that qualitative insight that we were learning back in 2010 or 2020? I think we're fundamentally going to be doing things differently, but in a way where you get it all without having to do more. So what I'm talking about here is when you can do a multi-site trial, when you can sample some of the situational features that you know will be different when you generalize, to see, in the end, it's preferences, beliefs, and constraints when it comes to generalizing. Tweak some of those in your original design. Block on, that's what I'm saying, right? Block on them, because that's we've placed all of our emphasis on internal validity, and that's important, because without internal validity, you must not talk about external validity. But what I'm saying is, with the proper research design, you can do both in the initial setting. And to drive that point home, I'm writing a textbook right now called A Course in Experimental Economics. And the front part is about, the potential outcomes model and how we use randomization to identify in the four assumptions, identification assumptions that we have to make. But I have the middle chapters on scaling and external validity and how we can use designs from the start to speak to those. You've heard some of them here, but that needs to be in our playbook from the beginning. And I think it's going to look more like policy-based evidence if we really want to change the world.
Thank you. Thank you for your really complete answer, John. So I'm so sorry. We are running very out of time right now. I know that there are some people in the public that had some questions. I'm so sorry. We're not going to be able to read them aloud this time. But anyway, I would really like to appreciate your presence here. I hope you had enjoyed this great presentation by John. And John, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we hope to continue being in contact with you so we can learn together.
That sounds great. Thanks, everyone. Raimundo, Marcelo, Ryan, thank you so much for having me and engaging in the panel. And yeah, let's change the world. And I can't wait to partner with UCEMA and our Field Experiments in Latin America initiative.
Great.
That
So
sounds
maybe
great.
to mention that briefly to the audience is that John was telling us that they're opening up a research center for conducting field experiments in Latin America, and he invited us to participate as part of the initiative. So we'll very much appreciate that, John, and count on us. So
awesome. That sounds great. That sounds great. So everyone have a great day, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.